Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Let's Translate Light Novels. In this series we are going to be looking at this light novel here, Seiran Den. It is a prequel to the anime Fushigi Yugi and it is about Nakago's past. And in this particular installment of Let's Translate Light Novels, we're going to be looking at some dialogue. How are dialogue tags handled? So this and the next couple videos we're going to be looking a little more at dialogue in light novels. But before we start, I have some notes and some disclaimers.
The objective of this series is not to walk away with a finished translation of this novel. In actual fact, we're probably only going to get through the first several pages. The purpose of this series is to teach Japanese grammar and vocabulary. Additionally, the series' objective is to show how you can take your understanding of Japanese and turn it into a proper translation. To demonstrate this, I'll be comparing and contrasting translations of this novel that I did in the year 2000 when I was at the intermediate level and completely new to translating, with translations from some of my patrons as well as my insights today as a professional translator with over 15 years experience. I do not own the rights to Seiran Den and I did not get permission from the author Nishizaki Megumi to translate it, so again, I would like to emphasize that the intention of this video series is not to produce a translation of this book, but to teach Japanese and to show how translation can be done. I won't be naming my patrons who have contributed their translations in these videos, but I will credit them in the video description if they wish. And now, on to the video.
In the next few videos, I've got translation submissions from 2 of my patrons. If you want to be in a group that actually translates these sections of light novel to have them critiqued by me in these videos, you can join my Patreon at the $12 tier and you'll be part of that group. I'll send you the little bits, the excerpts of the Japanese text, and you'll have a few weeks to send me back an English translation of it that I can then critique in these videos if you want. So chapter 1 is Nushi no Otsuge or Aruji no Otsuge. There's no furigana over the kanji, so who knows. So the verb tsugeru is to tell someone something, to deliver a message. Otsuge makes it an honorific sort of noun verb. It turns it into a noun. And I'm just gonna look it up real quick on jisho.org because I know what it means, but this is a translator brain thing that often happens where we know what a word means, like we totally know what it means, but it's just like if you press us for a dictionary definition or like certain synonyms, we can't necessarily get them off the top of our head. It's kind of like when somebody asks you for a definition of an English word and your brain kind of freezes. Yeah, an enunciation or an announcement, I would say an oracle or an enunciation makes a little more sense, or a revelation even. But yeah, enunciation would be good. I would maybe even just translate this as just plain enunciation because that does have religious implications. Patron A translated it as a divination from their lord. Divination, that's interesting. What does divination actually mean here? Again, I know what it means, but what does it actually mean? Let's get a dictionary definition. The practice of seeking knowledge of the future or the unknown by supernatural means. So it works. Even though divination was not one of the official translations of Otsuge, it still works. From their lord, I would just say from the lord, but their lord is not necessarily wrong. And patron B translated it as a message from on high. So Otsuge can be message as well. On high is an interesting interpretation here because, as I mentioned in the last couple videos, their lord, the Hin race that Nakago belongs to, their lord is actually the devil. They worship Tenko, who is the devil of this world. They don't know that he's the devil, that he's evil. So our traditional like Judeo-Christian image of like God is up there in heaven and Satan is down there, it's not necessarily universal that like God is up there and like Satan is down there. So a message from on high is a bit of a Western interpretation of that. It's basically just a message from the Lord or their God or something. And in the dialogue, you have ayuru, 6 dots, followed by a Japanese maru, and then ayuru again with 6 dots. So as I mentioned in the last video or two, Japanese ellipses are often very long. We will usually shorten those in the translations because English ellipses are not 6 periods long, followed by a maru, Japanese period. So patron 1 did ayuru question mark, ayuru question mark. Patron 2 did ayuru with 6 dots and then ayuru with 3 dots. So yeah, I personally prefer, well, ellipses and question marks kind of accomplish the same thing in this case. you'll see in the next sentence who is saying ayuru, 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 and what is the context of this person saying ayuru, ayuru. So the next sentence, we have some narration. うっすらと瞳を開けた少年の真上に、comma, so that's like the first part of our sentence, 自分の名を呼び続ける母、マトゥタの顔があった。So, うっすらと瞳を開けた, faintly opened, 少年の真上に, so directly above the boy, who faintly opened his eyes, comma, 自分の名を呼び続ける母, the mother who continues to call his name, Matuta, that's her name, no kao ga atta. So Matuta's face was there, directly above the boy. As he faintly opened his eyes, it was the face of his mother, Matuta, continuing to call his name. So Matuta is the person who's saying ayuru, dot, 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 ayuru, dot, dot, dot. So let's see how our patrons handled this. Patron A translated that as, the boy faintly opened his eyes and saw the face of his mother, comma, Matuta, comma, calling his name. That's a very straightforward translation. Patron B translated it as his eyes opened, faintly returning him to reality. That was not at all in the original Japanese. Standing there above him, calling his name, was the face of his mother, Maturu. Okay, so it's probably just like a read the ta as do, and then went with it. It's not a common name. Like, I think the author, Nishizaki Megumi, might have just completely made up this name, which is fine. This is an imaginary world with an imaginary tribe of people. So, you know, they have an imaginary language and everything. So it's fine that she has an imaginary name. So yeah, it's kind of like, as a translator, you're like, well, how do I even Romanize this name that doesn't necessarily exist? Often we're given a glossary by the publisher, like, this is how the names are Romanized, or this is how we want them Romanized. But this novel has no official translation, and it's way out of print by now. So who knows how it's supposed to be Romanized? But Matuta is definitely closer than Maturu. So I want to point out in Patron B, so in addition to just adding straight up, faintly returning him to reality, I don't consider that necessarily a mistranslation, because nothing is wrong in this description here. The boy in the previous chapter saw the devil at the summoning ceremony and then fainted, and now he's kind of unconscious, and then his mom's voice is bringing him back to reality. So it's not like wrong. It just wasn't really in the original Japanese. So it doesn't need to be there. I would just omit that. So as his eyes opened, standing there above him, calling his name, was the face of his mother, Maturu. So this is a Japaneseism here. In the Japanese, it's Matuta no kao ga atta, like her face, like his mother's, Matuta's face was there calling his name. That is literally what the Japanese was. But in English, we don't say that a face was calling somebody's name. We might say her lips or her mouth, but we wouldn't say like her face is calling his name. We would just say she was there calling his name. Or we would say, like, if you wanted to be a little more literal, more like the Japanese wording, you could say were like the lips of his mother, Matuta, calling his name. You wouldn't just say her face calling his name. But yeah, it's like neither of these translations are technically wrong, but as you can see, they're different. The next line of and I need to point this out. This is a bit of an elephant in the room, and it's going to come up a lot in these next few videos. So as you may notice, Japanese dialogue tags, as they're sometimes called, if you have a line of dialogue in English in a novel, it'll be like, Mom, I ate the chocolate cake and it was delicious, comma, Johnny said, climbing off the bed. That's kind of how it would be formatted in English. But in Japanese, it's like, Mama, I ate the chocolate cake and it was delicious, period, new paragraph. Johnny climbed down off of the bed and said to his mother. That's kind of how the dialogue works in Japanese. It's very confusing if you translate it literally. So sometimes you have to take some artistic license and do things like add a comma and like said Johnny and then have the paragraph, the description, or like, oh, Mom, end quote, comma, Johnny said as he climbed down off of the bed. I ate the chocolate cake and it was delicious. So you have to kind of consider how you're going to note who is saying what line of dialogue. You can do in novel writing like the description first, like Johnny climbed down from his bed and said, comma, quote, Mom, I ate the chocolate cake and it was delicious, end quote. But in Japanese, it's almost always going to be formatted like line of dialogue, new paragraph, and then the description, and by the way, this is the person that said that line of dialogue like 1 or 2 sentences ago. So anyway, that's what's happening in this first bit of text. You have ayuru ... ayuru ... and then we find out that it's as he's opening his eyes, we find out that his mother Matuta is the person who said ayuru ... In this case, it works to have the dialogue tag be a completely different paragraph, because if we're looking, if Ayuru is our POV character here, which he sort of is, at least in this moment of the chapter, we're seeing this through Ayuru's eyes. It's fine if like you have like, if this were an anime, you'd have like a black screen and you'd have Ayuru, Ayuru, and then like the screen would be fuzzy, and then you'd see a woman hovering over you. It's like your POV. That's kind of how it would be. So it's okay that we don't know, right away that it's Matuta that is saying this, but just explaining that if it were a different context, and we need to know that it's this person, this character saying that line, it's perfectly acceptable to add like a comma, said so-and-so, just because that's how we do it in English. Anyway, that was a long tangent, but an important one. So the next line, kasama, with 2 ellipses on either side of it. So six dots, kasama, 6 dots. Interesting, if you'll notice, patron A translated that as mother and then an ellipses, and then patron B translated it as an ellipses, mother, question mark. I like the question mark. I think that works just fine. Mother is fine. Kasama is a very like honorific, formal way of saying mother, saying mom. So mother works just fine. This is just a formatting thing, but in professional translation, we always discourage. I don't think I've ever really had a client that wanted me to put an ellipses at the start of a sentence. We pretty much always nix ellipses at the start of sentences. Again, personally, I like ellipses at the start of a sentence. It implies that the person is taking a while to say the thing, and it implies that they're kind of slow to start in saying the thing. So I like starting sentences with ellipses, but most publishers don't. So yeah, you would not have that beginning ellipses. You might put it at the end or no ellipses at all and just mother question mark. Narrative text. Haha wa kinchou no ito ga futsuri to kireta ka no you ni musuko no ue ni taorekomu to, comma, so that's like the first half of our sentence, or the first part of our sentence. Sono mi o tsuyoku dakishimeta. So haha wa, the mother, kinchou no ito ga kireta. That's an idiom. Literally means like the thread of tension was cut, is like literally what it means. But it means sort of like if you're feeling really, really tense, like, oh my God, is he gonna make that home run? Is he gonna make it? Is he gonna make it? And then he makes the home run, and then there's just this wave of relief, like, that is kinchou no ito ga kireru. That's like the thread of tension being cut. It's that rush of release and relief that you feel after a tense moment has been resolved. So that's what that idiom means. Futsurito. So that's a sort of onomatopoeia. So the translation in Google Translate is fluffy. That's wrong. That's why you should not always rely on just Google Translate. If you look at the sample sentences, though, abruptly, suddenly, with a snap. It's just like suddenly the thread of tension was cut. Musuko no ue ni taorekomu to. Oh, so it's kireta ka no yoni. So as if we went over this whole metaphor simile thing a lot in the last couple videos. So as if the thread of tension was like cut suddenly once and for all. The mother, taorekomu, fell, actually it's falls because it's present tense, because Japanese prose loves mixing up their tenses, falls on top of her son. Musuko no ue ni taorekomu to, so as she falls, or with a fall on top of her son, the mother, sono mio, so that body, her son's body, because we mentioned musko, so we know that we're referencing musko. That's what sono references. Sono mi, the son's body, the son, wo tsuyoku dakishimeta, strongly, fiercely hugged. So if you look at the tenses of the verbs, taorekomu to, and then dakishimeta. It's all past tense though. So we mentioned in the last couple of videos, Japanese prose mixes up their, the Japanese language mixes up their tenses a lot in their sentences. It's like whatever tense is at the end of the sentence, like if it's a past tense sentence, only the final verb at the very end has to be past tense. The rest of them need to be present. But even in like narrative text, they'll sometimes just mix up the ends of sentences with all different tenses of verbs. So it's your job as a translator to convert it all to past tense or present if that's what your client wants. So, translations. The mother fell upon her son and hugged him tightly as if the tension in her finally snapped. So again, as I mentioned in the last couple of videos, translating no yo ni in narrative prose as if or like, it's not always the wisest thing to do. They throw that yoni around a lot more liberally than we would like in English, or as if in English. And it's not like, I guess if you're using the idiom translated literally, as this patron sort of did, as if the tension in her finally snapped, then it kind of makes more sense to use that as if metaphor sort of language if you're going to keep the idiom sort of Japanese, which you can in this case. It kind of can sound a little more poetic if you do that. Snapped, for me, that kind of implies, like, if I say that somebody snapped, that means that they lost their temper or they went, "Gah!" But this is more like the tension snapped, which is kind of the opposite. So I don't think I would have used the word snapped there. It's sort of mixing up imagery there. But otherwise, it's correct. And then patron B's translation, maturu, matuta, we'll just assume, fell on, so instead of just saying the mother, this person chose to do the person's name, which is totally acceptable. Matuta fell on him and embraced her son, Ayuru, in a tight hug, as if, so both patrons kept it as a metaphor, as if she had let go of her worries all at once. All right, different way of wording it. Again, this kinchou no ito ga kireru is an idiom. So it's really one of those things you shouldn't necessarily translate it literally. And I think it tripped up both patrons. They both kind of went with a more literal translation there. I don't know, patron B is a little less literal. Let go of her worries all at once is a little more of a metaphorical translation of kinchou no ito ga kireru. So patron B and patron A, if you'll note what they did, they put the second half or the second part of the sentence at the start, which again is something you can definitely do in novel translation, and it's something that you sometimes should do. In Japanese, it's metaphor first, as if the threads of tension finally were cut. She fell on top of her son and hugged him fiercely. But in the translations that both patrons provided is she fell on top of him and hugged him fiercely, as if the threads of tension inside of her were finally cut. So there's one wording here in patron B's translation that's just a little overly wordy in English. Matuta fell onto him and embraced her son Ayuru. So it's a little messy. Fell onto him and embraced her son. You could just say Matuta fell onto her son Ayuru and embraced him. You don't usually be like the vague pronoun first and then you say what the pronoun was. You usually say what the pronoun is and then you use a pronoun, like her son, he, blah, 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 instead of he, blah, 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 her son, blah, 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 blah. So it would be like more like Matuta fell onto her son Ayuru and embraced him in a tight hug, as if she had let go of all her worries at once. Yeah, I would be more like feeling a wave of relief wash over her. The mother fell onto her son, hugging him fiercely. You know, that's kind of how I would do it. Obviously not exactly like that, but you know, that sort of feel. And then a line of dialogue. Yokatta! 6 dots and then the maru. Yatto ki ga tsuite kureta. So yokatta is like, thank goodness, what a relief. Yatto, finally, ki ga tsuite kureta. So ki ga tsuku is like to become conscious, to become alert. But since it has the kureta ending to it, that auxiliary verb, she's saying that he became conscious for her benefit. That's what that kureru auxiliary verb adds to that. It's a nuance that doesn't necessarily need to be translated. You wouldn't need to go like, thank goodness you have become conscious for my sake, even though that's like literally what it is. It's like people don't talk like that in English. You just have to express that like she is very grateful that he woke up because it is a big favor to her that he has woken up. Now she feels relieved and better. So patron A translated it as, you're finally awake, thank goodness. So they flip-flopped the order of that sentence, which again, that's totally fine. And then the other patron kept the order, thank goodness, ... you've finally come to, ! So, interesting choice. I suppose the exclamation point could kind of convey that kureta, that like you became conscious for me, and it's a good thing. So you express that with an exclamation point because that adds a little more emotionality to it. Neither of these translations are wrong. They're just different ways of expressing it. And then there's no dialogue tag. There's no comma said matuta. There doesn't exactly need to be. I think it's pretty clear who's saying that in English. So Japanese, next line, boku. Wow, is this 12? 12 dots. Boku, 12 dots. Are kara, 6 dots. Doushita no? So boku is a young, soft, masculine way of saying I or me. Are kara, so ever since then, that thing that happened. Doushita no? What happened to me? Or like, what was I doing? Ever since that thing that happened. That scary thing at the lake where we were summoning our devil as a tribe. Patron A translated that as just simply what happened to me with no dots. And then Patron B translated it the exact same way but with ellipses. What ellipses happened ellipses to me. I like there to be some ellipses in there. You can get a little excessive with ellipses if you keep all of them in. I would have added one ellipses, like at least. I would have been like, what ... happened to me. So you're kind of like, what happened to me? You could kind of think of it that way. So both patrons chose to do this next dialogue tag as a separate sentence and paragraph. This is a moment where instead of doing a separate sentence or paragraph, I would have just added this next line immediately after the quotes. If there were no question mark, it would be a comma inside the quotes, and then this thing. Ayuru wa kabosoi koe de haha ni touta. So ayuru wa, as for ayuru, kabosoi koe. So kabosoi is like a frail, like weak, shy, scared voice. Haha ni touta. So tou is to ask somebody. So touta, asked. He asked his mother. So again, if I were writing this like as a novel, I'd have the what ... happened to me. And then right after that, outside of the quotes, Ayuru asked his mother in a frail voice. I probably wouldn't word it that way because it would be unclear if he had the frail voice or if his mother had a frail voice. I probably would rephrase in a frail voice, asked in a frail voice to like croaked or squeaked or, you know, some verb that means to speak, but it's clear that you mean that that person is scared or weak. Patron A translated that as ayumu. That's just a typo. Ayuru asked his mother in a weak voice. And then patron B translated that as he asked her in a feeble voice. Both are acceptable. One just chose weak, the other chose feeble. Same thing, really. Like there's some slightly different nuances there. I personally prefer feeble, but that's somewhat subjective. Another line of dialogue. Are kara omae wa futsuka mo zutto nemutta mama de ellipses, period. Kasama doushitara ii ka to, long ellipses. So you've got two sentences that trail off. Japanese does this all the time. It's a very natural thing to do. It's very natural for speakers to do this, and it's also very natural for prose to do this. So the whole version of that sentence would be, Are kara omae wa futsuka mo zutto nemutta mama de okite kurenakatta. So it's like, you were out, asleep, all the time for 2 days and you didn't wake up, period. But they didn't put that okite kurenakatta part in there. They just left it out and replaced it with an ellipses. It's implied, and you didn't wake up. The second sentence, Kasama doushitara ii ka to nayandeta no yo. Like, that's kind of how you'd finish that with a verb. I was worried, sick, wondering what I should do. どうしたらいいか? Like, what should I do? と. And because there's a to there, it implies that a verb would follow. 自分に問いかけた. Like, I asked myself, what am I going to do? But instead there's an ellipses, because you can do that in Japanese. You can't necessarily do that in English, because we don't put our verbs at the ends of sentences. So you have to know where those sentences were going and fill in the blanks yourself. So, be interesting to see how my patrons handle these. Patron A, you've been asleep for 2 days, ... End quote, and then a new quote. Don't need that. That's not necessary. Just keep the quote going. Mother, just what should I have done? Ah, okay, so it looks like patron A got confused and thought that these were two separate lines of dialogue. The first from the mother, the second from Ayuru. They are not. She is referring to herself as kasama. She is using kasama as a first person, personal pronoun. She's calling myself. It's kind of like we do this in English too. Like if your son is younger, like 4 years old, like, mommy wants to take you to school right now. I talk like that to my cats all the time. Like, I'll call myself mommy. I'll be like, mommy loves you, Miney. Like, I'll say that all the time. So she's just using kasama as her pronoun. So it's not mother, just what should I have done? It's your mother, me, I didn't know what I should do. Patron B translated that as, you've been asleep for 2 whole days. That's better than just 2 days. 2 whole days, because 2日もずっと. That implies like 2日も眠った. It's like 2 whole days. That's what that mo does. I didn't know what to do, ... Yep, that's more correct translation. So nice catch that kasama is I. So, 声を震わせ、すすり泣く母の背を逆に優しくなぜながら、This is a nice long sentence. あゆるは2日前の晩の出来事を思い起こそうとした. So, this is another instance in which you could have added a dialogue tag to the former line. You've been asleep for 2 whole days. I didn't know what to do. She cried, her voice trembling, period, and then you could start a new sentence. See this 声を震わせ, the 声を震わせすすり泣く母 part could have been added as a dialogue tag to the line that came before it. You don't have to, but it could work better that way, perhaps. So yeah, 声を震わせ, to make one's voice shiver. すすり泣く. I don't know what susuri naku actually means technically. I imagine like sniffle. That's kind of what it sounds like. Naku is just to cry. Sobbing. Snuffle. Sniffle. Yeah. I was right. So, susuri naku, sniffle. So, sniffling with a shaky voice. Haha. So the mother who is sniffling with a shaky voice. No se, so the back of the mother who was sniffling with a shaky voice. Gyaku ni yasashiku naze nagara. So this gyaku ni part might be a little confusing. Let's put a pin in it for now. Yasashiku naze nagara. So this nazeru is kind of a weird verb. Usually it would be naderu. It means to caress or to pat. Yasashiku is gently. So while gently patting the back of his mother, who was sobbing and sniffling with a shaky voice. So this gyakuni part, it's implying, if you remember just a couple sentences before, she hugged him really strongly to console him. But now he is the one who is consoling her. So that's where the gyakuni comes from, like conversely. And it sounds really weird to word it in English that way. It would be more like, now it was his turn to console her as she cried or whatever. And this is another instance in which if you had added that dialogue tag, the koe o furuwase susuri naku haha, as a dialogue tag, it's Miney, to the line that came before it, Maidoko. Anyway, if you had added that as a dialogue tag, you might have been able to rework this sentence to be like, now it was his turn to console his mother by gently patting her back. Ayuru wa 2日前の晩の出来事, the thing that happened 2 evenings ago, wo omoi okosou to shita. So he tried to, okosou to shita. He tried to remember what happened 2 evenings before, as he gently caressed the back of his sobbing, sniffling mother, whose voice was shaky. So as you can see, the whole order of the sentence gets flipped around. Let's see how each patron handled it. So patron A. Ayuru stroked his mother's back, his voice trembling and tearful. That's not his voice, it's her voice. Koi o furuwase susuri naku haha. So that whole koi o furuwase susuri naku part goes with haha, the mother who is trembling and tearful. I mean, Ayuru was probably kind of tearful too, so it's not exactly far off. He tried to remember the events of 2 nights ago. And so it was kind of smart to separate this into just 2 sentences. If you'd kept it more literal, it was like, as Ayuru stroked his mother's back, trembling and tearful, comma, he tried to remember the events of 2 nights ago. That's what you would have done if you'd wanted to keep it in 1 sentence. Patron B translated that as, her voice trembled and she wept softly, period. Again, this patron chose to split it into 2 sentences, and there ain't nothing wrong with that. She gently caressed him. Nope, he's gently caressing her. Gyakuri. Okay, she gently caressed him, he gently caressed her, as he recalled the events of 2 days prior. It's as he tried to recall. Omoi okosou to shita. So a little messed up, both patrons there, on who's performing what actions. Otherwise not too terribly wrong. Back to the Japanese, let's finish this little paragraph. その途端、体の芯がぐらぐら揺れる感覚に襲われた. So その途端, that moment, totan, like totan is another onomatopoeia sort of thing. It's like toton, like clunk, like whoa. And the next thing he knew, the next moment, 体の芯, the inside, deep inside of his body, が gura gura, more onomatopoeia, to be shaky. And then yureru is also to shake. You'll often notice this in Japanese prose. You'll have an onomatopoeia and then you'll have the verb right after it that basically means the same thing as the onomatopoeia that came before it. It just really emphasizes it, and it works really well in Japanese, but it doesn't necessarily work in English. In English, it would be like, it was attacked with a sensation that was wobbling with a wobble. It's very redundant in English. Kankaku is a sensation, and then osowareta, passive voice, was attacked by, was assaulted by. So deep within his body, his core was assaulted by the sensation that it was like wobbling, tottering, or shaking that moment, the next moment, sono totan. Patron A translated that as, at that moment, he was struck by a shaking sensation from within himself. It probably needed a comma there. Don't ask me, I am not a comma expert. I scatter my commas like hayseed. But I think it needs a comma at that moment. Comma, he was struck by a shaking sensation from within himself. I like that wording there. That's really nice. Within himself, karada no shin. Again, it's kind of like your core. But within himself is really nice too. Was struck, I like that as well, from osowareta, by a shaking sensation from within himself. Patron B, at the time, cringe. It's okay, it's a very common mistake. His body had been violently shaken to its very core. Ah, I see. Patron B is interpreting this as he recalled the events 2 days prior. And at that time, 2 days prior, at the summoning ceremony, his body had been violently shaken to its very core. So Patron B misunderstood and thought that the boy was remembering what had happened and that when it happened, this is what it felt like. But actually, he was trying to remember what happened. And then now in the present, as he's trying to remember what happened to him, sono totan, as he was trying to remember the events of 2 days prior, his body was, his core was like hit with this sudden shaking sensation. But I like how Patron B chose core because again, karada no shin, I think core is a good translation of that. Just a misunderstanding of like what's past tense and what's present tense. Okay, now, this is just plain text. It's not in italics, it's not in parentheses, and it's not in quotes. But this is Ayuru's thoughts. So sometimes you have to kind of be a detective and figure out who's talking and who's thinking. そうだ 6 dots, comma. あの時も体がこんな感じになって 6 dots. そして 3 em dashes and then period. So the em dashes imply like this person's kind of like cutting off in their thoughts. Like they would say more things, but then something interrupts them. So it implies he's going to be interrupted by something in a moment. そうだ, that's right. あの時も あの時, so not that time, that moment, then, when it happened, 体がこんな感じになって, my body felt like this, like its core is being shaken. そして, and then, so patron A translated that as, that's right, he thought, they added a dialogue tag. This is pretty smart. I felt this way back then too. And this is all in italics because this is the boy's thoughts. And then em dash. So I think the and then would also be italics. I think the boy is still thinking this part as well, thinking the soshite. And then em dash. Patron B translated this as right, ellipses. That's what it felt like at the time. So again, rookie mistake, translating anotoki as the time or that time. It's really back then, or that day, that evening. It's referencing an event that happened in the past. And you can be more specific in your translation. You don't have to be vague in Japanese like that time. We don't say that in English usually. So, and then hyphen. So again, em dashes are your friend. I did not learn about the wonders of em dashes until a couple of years ago, but yeah, they are great. They're a good stand-in for commas, semicolons, ellipses. You can just throw them in everywhere. Parentheses, they're a great piece of punctuation there. If you want to end a sentence showing that somebody's being cut off, instead of a hyphen, do an em dash. Or like if you don't know how to type an em dash, like sometimes I'm lazy and I don't feel like copy pasting it in, just do a double hyphen and it kind of does the same thing. So next line of dialogue, hiragana u followed by a small tsu followed by 6 dots and then an exclamation point. Patron A translated that as ah, exclamation point. Patron B translated that as irk, ellipses, exclamation point. Yeah, for this case, since there's the small tsu after that, again, a small tsu at the end of a sentence or something, that implies a glottal stop. It's like instead of going ah, I go ah. It's like very like short. So I don't think an ellipses conveys that feeling as well in English. So I would just go ah, exclamation point, or irk, exclamation point. I like irk. Ugh would be good, exclamation point as well. He's going, that's what he's actually doing in Japanese. So ah isn't quite right. Irk is a little closer because it's more like, it's kind of more like a grunt. And then the next line, 少年は頭を押さえた. The boy pushed his head. Patron A, the boy pressed a hand to his temple. I like that specificity. It wasn't there in Japanese, but it helps get it across better. Again, this in Japanese, we know that the boy is like in pain and grunting, but it's not as clear in English. We don't exactly have a word necessarily, like a sound effect, a spoken one for that paints that picture. So I kind of like pressed a hand to his temple. Patron B, he clutched his head wincing in pain. I like the added wincing in pain as well, because again, like just ah or irk doesn't actually convey as much as does in Japanese. So I like both of these. I like the found in translation moment that both of my patrons had, adding in those little bits to just make it more clear what emotionality the boy was saying in as he was pressing his hand to his head. The next line, ayuru? Question, ... question mark, exclamation point in Japanese. Patron A, ayuru? Question mark, exclamation point, question mark. And then patron B, are you all right, ayuru? Exclamation point, question mark. So some clients are different. Most of the ones I've worked with want a question mark before exclamation point, not the other way around. And you wouldn't ever do a question mark and then an exclamation point and then another question mark. Again, I personally don't care, but this is more a professionalism thing. So yeah, it would pretty much usually just be ayuru and then question mark, exclamation point, or exclamation point, question mark, depending on what order your client wants it in. 母が頭を起こし、息子を心配げに見やった. So the mother raised her head. She was collapsed over on her son, remember, and he was hugging her gently and consoling her. And then he went, oof. And so she raised her head. And 心配げに, worryingly, 見やった, looked at her son, 息子を, worryingly. So she looked at her son, she lifted her head and looked at her son with worry. Patron A translated that as the mother raised her son's head, looking at him in worry. 母が頭を起こし. The atama is implying the mother's head. But again, in Japanese, it doesn't specify. But yeah, from context, the mother raised her head and looked at her son in worry. Patron B, she raised her head, correct, with a look of concern for her son in her eyes. It's a little wordier than it originally was in Japanese, but it means the same thing, and I like it. Dialogue. ごめんね, 6 dots, period. お前を連れて行かなければよかった. So I'm sorry, I shouldn't have taken you with me. 連れて行かなければよかった. It would have been good if I had not taken you with me. Patron A translated as forgive me. I like that for ごめんね. I shouldn't have brought you there. That's fine. I'm so sorry, Patron B, ... I shouldn't have brought you with me that day, ... So again, you don't have to copy over every single ellipses. Sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. I don't think it really needs both ellipses. I don't think it needs the second one. I shouldn't have brought you there. I shouldn't have brought you with me that day. I just think I shouldn't have brought you with me is fine. You don't necessarily need that day or there, but neither of them are wrong either. Next line, 息子は激しく首を振った. So the son violently, furiously, 首を振る, shake your head, no. So the son violently or furiously or vigorously shook his head. Patron A, the son shook his head. Took out the 激しく. It's fine, you don't always need to keep in all the adverbs. Although I think it's important. She's like saying, I'm sorry, I'm such a bad mom. I shouldn't have brought you with me to the devil summoning ceremony. And the boy's like, no, Mom, you're fine. You know, it's like he's like violently shaking his head like, no, don't say that, Mom. Don't say that. You're a good mother. Patron B, he shook his head vigorously. That's fine. Yeah, like, I don't know how small Sarah translated this. I'm not comparing my old translations in this video because it's long enough already as it is. If I compared mine as well, it would be like an hour or more long. I probably would have translated that as violently back in the day. Hageshiku does not always mean violently. It means like intensely. Vehemently, I think, would be a good adverb to use in this context. Oh, good. The last line of this video, because my throat is getting tired. She responds, 違う, ... yo, period. Oh, that's what he's saying this. ... 僕が育児なし, ... だったんだ, ... So 違うよ, 僕が育児なしだったんだ. If you remove all the ellipses. It can be easier to parse things out if you just remove all of the ellipses, because then it sounds more like an actual sentence. So you're wrong, or no, or don't say that. 違うよ. 僕が ikuji nashi is a coward or cowardly. だったんだ, so I was a coward. And then this nda at the end, he's explaining something. He's like, no, you're wrong. It wasn't your fault. It was my fault. I was a coward. That's basically what the implication is there. Patron A translated it as, it's all right, I was just a coward. That's fine, translating the chigaoyo as it's all right. It's like he's trying to tell her, no, you don't have to apologize. Like, it was my fault for being such a coward. Patron B translated chigaoyo as no, that's fine, perfectly acceptable. It's that I just don't have any backbone, or, well, I didn't. Okay, so Patron B, if they had omitted all the ellipses and just put the whole sentence together without ellipses, they probably would have picked up on this and noticed that it's just a sentence. 僕が意気地なしだったんだ. I was a coward. But if you leave the ellipses in, you might mistakenly think it's two different sentences. 僕が意気地なし. I'm a coward. And then だったんだ. I was. You know, you'd think it's two sentences. And that's what happened, I think, here with patron B. They got tripped up by the many, many ellipses. So if you're translating something that has a lot of ellipses, just take them out, and then it's easier to see what you're looking at. All right, that is the end of this section of Let's Translate Light Novels. My throat is very hoarse, so I'm gonna call it quits for now. I hope you will join me next month. There will be 2 more installments of Let's Translate Light Novels. We're taking this about 1 page at a time, so super slow, but hopefully we'll get a nice detailed deep dive into this, which is what we all want on this channel. And again, if you want to have your translations critiqued in these very videos, it's not too late. You can join my $12 patron tier on Patreon. The link is in the video description. And on that note, thank you to all of the patrons who support this and my main channel, Sarah Moon. I want to give a special thanks to Greg, Lay, and Henry Roaming, and to my patrons who contributed to this video. If they want to be known, their names will be in the video description below. And I hope you will tune in next month to find out what happens to Ayuru and his mother next.